The story we are about to tell began long before kings and temples, before borders, before calendars. It began with the slow, patient chemistry of the planet atoms combining into molecules, molecules into cells, cells into communities of life. For nearly 4 billion years, life tried, failed, adapted, and survived. Then, in a relatively brief turn of the geological clock, one small branch of life made a choice that would tilt the future. It stopped moving. It was not dramatic at first. For millennia, humans moved with the seasons, following herds and wild grains. Then, in certain places near rivers, in fertile valleys, people learned to seed and to tend. They found that if you keep seeds, you do not depend entirely on decay and chance. If you irrigate, harvest, store, you can survive droughts. If you store, you must count. If you count, you must remember. If you must remember, you begin to write. This choice to settle was the hinge of history. It changed bodies and bones. Skeletal remains from farming sites show shorter statures and new disease patterns. It changed families and gender roles. Stable food allowed some people to specialize in different crafts. It changed politics. Grain in a common store could be taxed, guarded, or stolen. And when surplus accumulates, people invent systems to manage it, religions to justify it, law to regulate it, force to defend it. But settlement also produced wonders: cities, monuments, literature. In the hours ahead, we will trace how a handful of human choices compound into empires, faiths, and technologies. We will look at how networks of trade and conquest stitched far-flung worlds together, how faiths bound strangers, how laws tried to order societies, and how, time and again, ambitions rose and gave way. This film is not a catalogue of names. It is a narrative about the experiments humans ran, what worked, what failed, and what lessons we might borrow. Let's start on the floodplain, where some of those experiments first matured. In southern Mesopotamia, in the marshy loop between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the city of Uruk rose like a human experiment in density and organization. Archaeologists find streets, temples, monumental architecture, and crucially, evidence of storage. Grain was collected, rationed, and redistributed. That needed bookkeeping. Small clay tokens evolved into pressed marks on wet clay, the first cuneiform. The earliest scribes recorded measures of grain, rations to laborers, and shipments. The first writing was administrative. It was born of accounting. It's easy to romanticize ancient life as peaceful. The truth is more complex. Sedentary life allowed specialization: potters, metalworkers, priests, but it also concentrated disease and inequality. Skeletons show changes in diet and dental wear. Bones sometimes reveal heavy labor and healed fractures. In Uruk, a palace and a temple were both centers of power. The palace organized labor for irrigation and defense. The temple organized ritual and storage. In that arrangement, temples could function like banks. Trade networks began to reach beyond the local basin. Copper and tin necessary for bronze traveled long distances. Exotic stones and timber arrived by river and sea. With trade came new relationships: the merchant class, the craftsman guild, the scribe's prestige. Over generations, these roles became institutionalized. Specialization also produced innovation. Craftsmen refined metallurgy, making stronger tools. Architects learned to stack mud bricks into complex structures. Potters developed mass techniques. The gains were real. Surpluses rose, populations increased, and towns turned into cities. Yet the cost was that more people lived within a web of obligations: taxes, corvée labor, and obligations to rulers whose power often rested on controlling stored food. Across Eurasia, rivers produced parallel stories. In the Indus Valley, Harappa, and Mohenjo-Daro, cities display an almost modern dedication to planning. Streets run in a grid, houses have bathing platforms, and covered drains carry wastewater away. The standardization of brick sizes and weights suggests centralized administration and a trust in rules. Yet scholars still debate their political organization. Their script resists our decipherment, and so much remains tantalizingly silent. To the west, Egypt owed its rhythms to the Nile. The annual flooding deposited silt and orchestrated the agricultural year. Pharaohs positioned themselves as mediators between cosmic order and human life. Divine kings, whose tombs, temples, and bureaucracy organized a civilization that would endure thousands of years. Building projects like pyramids and later temples were monumental statements. They visually compressed the claims of a ruler to cosmic and administrative control. In the Yellow River Basin in China, the story takes a somewhat different tone. Here, legends like that of Yu the Great emphasize hydraulic control levees, canals, and flood management as the foundation for rulership. Archaeology finds early bronze metallurgy, oracle bones, and growing administrative complexity. The stage is set for dynastic cycles in which heaven's favor can be read in the land's prosperity or in famine and flood. Each river civilization developed unique institutional answers to the same problems: how to organize surplus, how to manage labor, and how to legitimate authority. They invented writing, law, and religious frameworks that would guide successive generations. They also connected to long-distance trade networks. Mesopotamian merchants reached the Indus. Egyptian goods circulated to the Levant. Over centuries, these networks stitched large parts of Eurasia into exchange systems that would be the arteries of later empires. As societies grew, so did the need to regulate behavior. Hammurabi of Babylon famously set his laws into stone, 282 rules, etched on a stela for public display. The code tells us more about social structure than about abstract justice. Punishments vary by class. Commerce, marriage, and property are tightly regulated. The act of carving laws into durable stone is itself a political performance, an assertion that the ruler's order will outlast human memory. Nearby, the Hittites developed a different but complementary skill set: diplomacy and iron. Where other societies might focus solely on conquest, the Hittites used treaties to stabilize borders, an early example of the idea that peace can be a policy. Their treaty with Egypt, preserved in both kingdoms' records, shows formal clauses, hostage exchanges, and mutual obligations. It's a reminder that even violent worlds sought manageability through law. Across the Aegean, Mycenaean palaces stood as nodes of a palace economy. Wealth was concentrated in elite complexes. Warrior culture and fortified sites produced a narrow elite that patronized monumental tombs and martial traditions. That world would later fragment, but its cultural echoes survive in epic memories that shape classical Greece. States invent law to make cooperation reliable. Law gives markets confidence and rulers legitimacy. The problem is that law can ossify inequality. Rules that seem necessary to keep order can become instruments to maintain privilege. That tension, order versus fairness, will recur in every era we explore. Greece offers a new kind of experiment: the city-state. Small polities like Athens and Sparta became laboratories for political systems. Sparta dedicated itself to military discipline, boys trained from childhood to be soldiers, social systems structured to produce warriors. Athens, by contrast, nurtured debate. Citizens, free adult males assembled in the agora, argued matters of law and policy, and introduced procedures like sortition to limit oligarchy. Athenian democracy was imperfect. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded, but it was radical in treating speech as civic action. Drama and philosophy flourished. Tragedies staged civic anxieties. Comedies satirized leaders, and philosophers asked what constitutes the good life. Plato worried that untrained crowds could be misled. Aristotle catalogued ethics, politics, and biology in empirical detail that would inform later science. Beyond philosophy, military realities reshape politics. The Persian invasions of the early 5th century BCE united Greeks in defense and produced a confident cultural self-image. Later, internal conflicts, most notably the Peloponnesian War, would expose the fragility of city coalitions. When Macedonia under Philip, and then his son Alexander, rose with new military and administrative innovations, Greece's city-state model met an empire. Alexander's campaigns fused Greek culture with the lands he conquered. New cities. Alexandrias became hybrid centers where Egyptian, Persian, Greek, and Indian ideas exchanged. The Hellenistic world shows how conquest spreads culture, but also how that culture mutates in contact. South Asia's political experiments culminated in the Mauryan Empire, one of the first to unify large swaths of the subcontinent under centralized administration. Chandragupta Maurya founded the state. Ashoka, his grandson, remains the exemplar of a ruler who publicly wrestled with the ethics of power. After a devastating war in Kalinga that left the countryside in ruin, Ashoka embraced Buddhist principles, publicly and in stone. His edicts, carved on pillars and rocks across the realm, exhort compassion, respect for all sects, and humane treatment. They are not merely pious lines, they are administrative directives guiding officials about hospitals, roadside trees, and the welfare of prisoners. Ashoka's turn shows an important historical idea. Conquest can be the catalyst for reflection. Empires that begin in force sometimes reorient toward legitimacy, grounded in moral leadership. The Mauryan roads and administrative systems also facilitated trade, helped standardize weights and measures, and connected distant provinces in ways that supported the spread of ideas. Buddhist missionaries, for example, traveling along the same routes merchants used. In trade's wake came urban centers, coins, and a literary culture. India's intellectual horizon expanded philosophies, debated the self and the world. Mathematics explored numerical systems, and art reflected syncretic influences. The Mauryan period is a reminder that empire building and cultural innovation often co-occur, producing long legacies that survive the political frame that produced them. Rome's story is a study in institutions, how rules, offices, and habits can create a polity resilient enough to expand across seas and mountains. From a city of hilltop villages, Rome forged a republic in which power was mixed among consuls, senate, and assemblies, at least in theory. The republic's expansion was uneven and often brutal. Rome learned to build navies, to levy citizen armies, and to assimilate defeated peoples by granting citizenship or local autonomy. The Punic Wars with Carthage were formative. Rome's victory in the First Punic War made it a Mediterranean naval power. Hannibal's audacity crossing the Alps with elephants proved a tactical legend, yet Rome's capacity to field new armies and strike at Carthage itself turned the tide. After the Second Punic War, Rome's dominance was clear. But institutions stress under pressure. Land concentration, indebted smallholders, and ambitious generals like Caesar revealed structural tensions. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon was a constitutional rupture. His assassination was a failed remedy. The Republic then gave way to an imperial system under Augustus, a principate that preserved republican forms while consolidating power in a single hands. The Roman Empire then built roads, law, aqueducts, and a fiscal structure that bound provinces to a Mediterranean core. The Pax Romana allowed trade, legal norms, and cultural flows to settle for centuries. Rome's legacy is both technical and moral. Roman law, codified later in Justinian's Corpus Juris Civile, provided a vocabulary for rights, property, and law that influenced European legal culture centuries later. Rome's monumental architecture declared power, Its engineering made empire possible. Religions shaped empires and empires shaped religions. Christianity began as a small Jewish sect in Roman provinces. Its early growth relied on tight communities, networks of letters, and a theology that promised meaning to the marginalized. Paul of Tarsus transformed Christianity into a missionary religion, writing letters that circulated and founded pockets of believers across the Eastern Mediterranean. Persecutions like those under Nero made martyrs whose stories strengthened communal bonds. When Constantine adopted Christianity in the 4th century and the Council of Nicaea asserted orthodoxy, an empire began to use religious conformity as a tool of unity. Later, Christianity became the state religion under Theodosius. But parallel religious experiments continued elsewhere. Zoroastrian Persia remained a philosophical rival. Indian religions and philosophies evolved. Buddhism spread across Asia. In Arabia, a different religious movement emerged. Muhammad's message in Mecca and Medina forged a community that fused spiritual teaching with political organization. After the Hijra to Medina, the mosque became a center of legal, civic, and religious life. Within a century, Arab forces and administrators had constructed an Islamic polity spanning from Iberia to Sind. The early caliphates facilitated translation, administration, and exchange. Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo became nodes in a cosmopolitan learning network. Religions offered social glue, laws, moral narratives, networks of charity, and legitimacy for rulers. But they also became grounds for contest over orthodoxy, authority, and public life. The interplay between belief and power shapes much of the medieval map. The late antique centuries were transitionary, violent, uneven, but full of continuity. The Huns pushed across the Eurasian steppe, displacing peoples and unsettling borders. The sack of Rome in 410 by the Visigoths shook the idea of Rome's inviolability. Yet the story isn't simple collapse. Much administrative knowledge and urban life persisted in the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire. Justinian sought to reconquer Western territories and codified Roman law so that later Europe would read Roman legal ideas in medieval courts. In the West, war and migration transformed urban networks and economies. In the East, Constantinople stood as a living claim to imperial continuation. The Sasanian Persian state contested Rome-Byzantium for centuries, sometimes winning, sometimes bargaining, but preserving a Persian cultural and administrative core. Trade continued along the Silk Road, even as empires rose and fell. It carried silk, spices, and ideas, and later pathogen. The movement of peoples and goods remade demographics and made the client networks that new Islamic polities would inherit. The period yields an important lesson. Political fall does not mean intellectual or cultural death. Libraries, legal practices, and traditions continue. They are repurposed by new powers. The medieval era is multiple. In the Islamic world, Baghdad's House of Wisdom gathered Greek texts, Indian mathematics, and Persian science. Scholars translated Aristotle and Ptolemy, developed algebra, and built hospitals that anticipated modern clinical ideas. Figures like Al-Khwarizmi and Al-Razi pushed knowledge forward. Meanwhile, in West Africa, the Mali Empire earned renown through trans-Saharan trade. Mansa Musa's famous pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century announced Mali's wealth to the broader Muslim world and drew scholars to Timbuktu. Over the Pacific and Atlantic, other equally complex civilizations flourished. The Maya built astronomical systems, extensive cities, and hieroglyphic script. The Aztecs engineered Tenochtitlan on a lake with causeways and Chinampa agriculture. In East Asia, the Tang dynasty in China produced a cosmopolitan culture poetry, printing innovations, and advances in navigation. Cities in these regions experienced commerce, art, and institutional complexity independent of Europe. The medieval map is not Eurocentric, it is globe-wide. Trade routes overland and maritime linked these distant polities in an uneven web. Spices from Southeast Asia, gold from Africa, and silks from China moved with merchants whose networks presaged later global exchange. This is an age of mobility. Viking longships slip quietly into monasteries and harbors. Varangians travel east to found dynasties in the rivers of what would become Russia. The Viking world demonstrates that small, mobile societies could exert dramatic influence far from home. Their settlements in Normandy, England, and even North America show the reach of maritime skill. In the same centuries, European Christendom mounted the Crusades, military expeditions to the Levant that mixed piety, politics, and profit. Crusader states were established and later contested. Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem is a pivotal moment. It demonstrates how local leaders can recycle regional power to reclaim lost ground. The Crusades leave legacies of trade, cultural exchange, and violent memory. From the steppes came another powerful actor, the Mongols. Genghis Khan united the tribes, built an army of horse archers with a command system of communication and intelligence, and created an empire of extraordinary reach. The Mongols destroyed, but they also connected, establishing a Pax Mongolica that made long-distance trade safer and reactivated Silk Road exchange. Ideas and technologies flowed faster in those decades. The net result of these movements was a world more connected than before, but connection also multiplies vulnerability. Trade accelerates wealth and ideas and disease. A confluence of technologies and ideas reopened Europe to older horizons. The Renaissance was powered by patronage, curiosity, and the return of classical texts filtered through Arabic translations and Byzantine manuscripts. Artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo fused art and study, anatomizing the human body to render it more realistically. Perspective in painting changed how Europeans saw space and form. The printing press Gutenberg's mechanized movable type made text reproducible and scalable. Suddenly, ideas traveled faster and at lower cost. With print came literate publics, people who could read pamphlets and mobilize opinion. Martin Luther harnessed this power. His 95 theses spread not because they were nailed, but because they were printed and read. The Reformation splintered Christendom into confessions and created centuries of confessional politics. Renaissance and Reformation were also economic phenomena. Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, and Genoa were commercial hubs. Banking innovations, double-entry bookkeeping, and proto-capitalist enterprises began to transform how wealth moved. These changes would enable overseas exploration and later the commercial empires of European powers. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he did not discover an empty world. He met and encountered living cultures in the Americas Taino, Nahua, Maya, and many others whose histories stretch back millennia. What followed was a sustained process of contact trade, conquest, and catastrophic biological exchange. Smallpox and other Eurasian diseases decimated indigenous populations who had no prior immunity. These demographic shocks reshaped power balances and facilitated European conquest. Conquistadors like Cortés and Pizarro used alliances with local enemies, superior weaponry, and disease to dismantle Aztec and Inca polities. The Spanish and Portuguese established extractive colonial systems, creating new global flows. Silver from Potosi filled European treasuries. Sugar plantations in the Atlantic created labor systems that turned into the transatlantic slave trade. The Columbian Exchange remade diets maize to Africa and Europe, potatoes to Ireland, and new staples that would feed populations and fuel industrialization. European empires did more than extract. They also built administrative systems, mission churches, and mixed cultures in which Creoles, mestizos, and others created new identities. The age of exploration stitched the hemispheres into an Atlantic world, and that stitched world is the prelude to the global economy we live in now. The Enlightenment's ideas about rights, representation, and reason met hard political reality in the late 18th century. The American Revolution experimented with constitutionalism. The French Revolution sought liberty, equality, and fraternity, and then descended into terror as internal enemies and external wars pressured leaders into radical measures. The Napoleonic era reconfigured Europe and spread some revolutionary ideas by forced administrative reforms, legal codes, and nationalism. Industrialization then altered the economic basis of society. Coal, steam, and mechanized production concentrated labor in factories and shifted populations to cities. The factory system changed daily life and produced both immense wealth and intense social dislocation. New social questions emerged: labor rights, urban sanitation, and political inclusion. Thinkers like Marx and Engels would articulate a critique of capitalist industrial society that would inspire later political movements. The 19th century also saw the modern scramble for colonies. Advances in weaponry, medicine, at least partly, and administration allowed European powers to rule large overseas empires. The partition of Africa at the Berlin Conference in 1884-85 divided the continent into European spheres of influence with little regard for existing ethnic or political boundaries. Imperialism fueled competition between nation-states and sowed tensions that would flare in the 20th century. The 20th century compressed the promise and peril of modernity. 2 world wars devastated populations and states. World War I, with its entangled alliances and industrialized slaughter, destroyed empires and produced a search for peace that often failed. World War II, even more total, revealed the capacity of modern states for genocide and self-annihilation. The post-war order attempted to stabilize this world. The United Nations, international law, decolonization, and economic institutions sought to rebuild and to prevent global conflict. The Cold War divided the planet into blocks, but it also spurred technological competition, the space race, nuclear deterrence, and huge investments in science. Computers, born in wartime laboratories and accelerated by Cold War needs, matured into a global revolution. Alan Turing's early ideas became concrete machines. Decades later, microchips and networks would knit the world together. In 1969, a man walked on the moon, an image of possibility and of geopolitical rivalry made manifest. Globalization has delivered riches and inequality. Markets cross borders, supply chains link continents, and information travels instantly. But globalization also exposes fragility. Pandemics spread on airplanes. Financial shocks ripple across continents. Climate change is a planetary problem born of industrial energy use. As we close, remember an ancient voice. The Epic of Gilgamesh asks what we leave behind. Gilgamesh sought immortality and was denied. Instead, he learned to value a life well lived and what can be built for others: a wall, a garden, a story. Civilizations are mortal. They leave monuments and laws, songs and scars. The real question for our generation is not whether we will build monuments. The servers and towers are already arising, but whether we will leave behind institutions and relationships that make life better for the many, not just the few. History is a set of experiments. Some worked for a time. Others failed spectacularly. We inherit the consequences, and that inheritance is, in part, a responsibility to judge, to learn, and to choose differently.